Hi folks, so this is a test here because I want to test the streaming software, but I thought, make sure to get my audio right and all that, but I still thought maybe I'd just take a little time here and just talk about something. So I hope you hang with me for a little bit, and you can see I'm using the virtual background there, and it's kind of weird because as I'm watching this, there's this time lag, so I'm not really seeing myself in real time. So let's see what we're talking about today. What I want to talk about today is how to get 5e players, interested in old school games, or what happens when you bring them to an old school table. And let's be honest, they're really not used to it. Things are kind of different for them. So let's see what we're going to talk about. And as I'm doing this, I'm kind of watching. I'm trying to put it on my other monitor here so I can take a look. Let's see what we're going to talk about as I'm doing this. And let me turn that off so we don't get any echo here. And have that as a problem. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk today about players who started with 5e. And 5e has been around nearly 10 years. In 2024, it'll be 10 years. So that's really a lot of people if you're looking at that. Also, this way, by having it on the other side, I can take a look at the chat if anybody's stopping by. I doubt it, but we'll take a look. Also, just for those of you who tech information, I'm using Skype because I wanted to try a virtual background. So that's why you see that virtual background behind me. So in any event, we're talking about players who started with 5e, and they're generally younger or newer players, and often they've had little experience with older editions or even other games and genres. Now, I want to start out by saying this, that none of this is meant as a slight to newer players. This is not gatekeeping in any way, and certainly not any edition wars. I think, unless you're a total grognard or a total newbie, you've probably played different editions and versions and probably had a good time. So none of that here. This is just to say, what's different about 5e, or what might 5e players have a hard time with, when they come to an older edition. So here's some thoughts, and here's my experience. I'm a teacher, and this year we started the D&D club at my high school where I teach. So I do run a table, and I also have some student dungeon masters who they're running their own games. Although I will say this, as the year's gone on, that's dwindled down a little bit. So I have at my table players who've only played 5e, and also a few who've never played any edition at all, who are, totally new to the game. So those are the folks who are around my table, and that's great. I'm happy to have them. So what do I run? What I run is, basically basic fantasy. Well, I've made a few adjustments to it and all that, but it really is, for the most part, basic fantasy with some minor adjustments. So, for example, I just use modifiers. I don't really use the 3 to 18 range for ability scores. And like for thief abilities, all right, if they're doing a dex check, we just do advantage, and that's what that is. Now, sadly, I only get to run every other week during our club period. So for me, I really need a system that's quick and very easy for new players. So what are some things that, maybe they struggle with, that maybe they have some difficulties with? And let's try and break it down into categories. We can first talk about combat. One thing to note is they're definitely, if they've played 5e, used to a lot more options, like attacks of opportunity, dash actions, and things like that. So it's kind of like, oh, what do I do now when those things are taken away? It is, old school tends to be a little bit simpler on the combat. They're also not as used to the lethality, and you can definitely see it in the way that they play. For example, they might walk into the middle of a goblin camp to try and distract them, never realizing that you're putting yourself in the middle of all these enemies, and that could be a problem. Or I had another newer player. Okay, the bear is guarding the cave. I'm going to attack it. This is, I think it was like a second level thief attacking a bear. Really bad idea. So some of it may be that 5e superhero mentality. And I'm not saying every 5e player has that, but maybe some younger ones do. They're also not used to planning for combat. And I usually try to give a warning like, okay, you hear some noise up ahead or you see a campfire, so I don't want to surprise them or spring anything unfairly on them. So they're not really used to talking to each other and saying, okay, well, maybe how should we approach this? Are there some old school groups that maybe don't do that too? Sure. But I do see it with the 5e or the younger players. And as I said, I don't think these concerns are strictly unique to 5e players. Some of it might be just that they really are learning the game or approaches to the game. Now, in terms of role-playing, Thursday nights, man, I got a great group of veteran players. We've gone entire 2-hour sessions without rolling a dice roll, and everybody still had fun. It was a lot of role-playing, a chance to interact with the NPCs in town. And absolutely, certainly that's possible, I'm sure, with 5e. Although I'll say my players or the high school players don't seem as into it. For example, if a sheriff is hiring them to do a job, they really maybe only have 1 or 2 questions, when really if they would ask a bunch, I'd give them a bunch of information, to try and prep them for what's coming next. Now, I don't generally require charisma or social roles, unless it's a particularly tough encounter, one where maybe things could go south and it could get led into combat. So I'm really hoping that they'll, role play and talk to people. Now, just a note, again, to say, I'm absolutely sure there's some 5e groups which have great role playing. There's plenty of streams online where they do that. So some of this could just be, with having a newer group. Magic. Definitely. They're not used to having fewer spells and not having those cantrips like Shocking Grasp or things like that. Another problem can be, and this could be true of between any editions, but especially 5e and older editions, they're not used to the spell descriptions. That things might work a little differently in a different edition. So what I've done is I've put quick little spell descriptions right on the character sheets to help them out. And also, I think maybe they're not used to the fact that, especially at lower levels, magic users aren't superheroes. They're not going to have a ton of spells. They shouldn't be wading into combat. They should be really thinking tactically, and where can I use this spell best, like that sleep spell or something like that. Now, for exploration, I've actually found there's not a whole lot of difference between 5e and older edition necessarily. Specifically, I don't necessarily always ask for rolls. I might try to say, instead of saying, oh, give me a perception roll, rather than doing that right off the bat, I'd say, okay, well, how are you checking this hallway to see if there's any traps? And usually they pick up on that cue. Oh, okay, I'm throwing some stones ahead of me, or rolling some stones, or tapping with I have my sword held out and I'm tapping with the edge to see if there's any kind of trap on the floor or the wall. So actually in that way, I haven't found a whole lot of difference. I think it's kind of, as the GM, I have to urge them along or say, okay, well, what would you like to try? So this will be just a short live stream. Again, this is a test, seeing how it works. And so in conclusion, I generally run older style games. That's mostly personal preference. I'll play something heavier. I'll play 5e, but really somebody else has to run it, or I'd play 3rd edition or Pathfinder, but somebody else would have to run it and, help me out with telling me what to roll. Now, if you're following D&D channels, you probably hear a lot about DM burnout and DM shortages for 5e. And that big old bear of a rule set might have something to do with it, Watsy. Just keep that in mind. Just a little aside there. And as another YouTuber, The Basic Expert, who I really enjoy his channel, said, Game Masters should be challenging the players. The players should not be challenging the GM, with the rule set, if the rule set is so burdensome. Now, as a caveat, I don't want to say, oh, well, the GM should just be killing players left and right. GM should be fair, but they do want to be presenting some challenges for the players to work through. So what would I say? Absolutely open-minded 5e players can adapt to older rule sets. And I'm sure the same is true going the other way. With us grognards can adapt to a 5e game. Absolutely. This was interesting. One of the predominantly 5e players said how this lighter system is actually much better for new people. That they're really used to the 5e, but they could see how a new person might need a simpler system. So definitely that player really got the point of what I was trying to do. And here's a little interesting side comment that some 5e folks are actually a little worried about switching to 6th edition, or they're going to call it 1D&D. Here's my take. Don't switch. Do not switch. Enjoy what you're playing. Play what you're playing already now. Just enjoy that. Or take a look at some lighter options or some older options. They're certainly out there. And for you 5e players who aren't going to switch, hey, welcome to the OSR. Some people might say technically it's not old school or that everybody has their definitions. But hey, if you're playing an expired edition, I think that's great. Welcome to the OSR. We have a great time with our older rule sets. And here's a little thing. It's much cheaper because we already own the books, or you can get clones for pretty cheap. So those are some things to think about. So that's my first live stream. Thanks for being here with me, folks. And take care and have a great day. And we'll see you again some other time.